Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics, and I've got a fun one for you today. I've been wanting to do this for a long time. We are going to be talking about the kick-sub relationship in your mix, and specifically how to manage the phase coherence between your kick and your sub. And we're going to talk a lot about sidechain ducking and how to do it right and how not to do it, and what tools to use for sidechain ducking. Now, this whole video is very product neutral. I'm going to be showing you this stuff in Bitwig, but you can duplicate these concepts and techniques in any DAW. And I'm going to slay a whole lot of golden cows, golden calves, whatever the metaphor is. There's a lot of stuff that YouTube videos will teach you about how to sidechain your kick and your sub, and a lot of them are wrong. I'm sorry, they're just bad techniques. It's easy know-how for someone to pass around, and then telephone game happens and people don't really understand, but they parrot what they heard. And there's just a lot of things wrong with a lot of the videos around there that teach you how to sidechain and show you examples of sidechaining. There's tools for sidechaining that are really just terrible tools for sidechaining your kick and your sub, and they'll mess up your kick-sub relationship, and they'll mess up the low end of your song. So if you're curious about nothing else and you want to know why I say that, what I think is the best way, I'm going to show you in detail. This is going to be a heavy, heavy deep dive. It's going to take a while. Settle back, get a drink, whatever. And also, if you're listening to this on your iPhone or your laptop speakers or some crappy earbuds, stop right now. Wait until you're in a studio with your good speakers or your good headphones, and you can really hear the low end, because I'm going to be teaching you how to critically listen to the low end and recognize and hear when your kick and your sub are out of phase. And this is a skill you have to learn. Not everyone has this at first. Just like a lot of things in production and mixing and mastering, you have to teach yourself what to listen for and how to recognize it. Okay, so briefly, I'm going to talk about the kick-sub relationship in a little more detail. I'm going to explain why phase coherence is crucial and how to hear when they're out of phase, how to see when they're out of phase with the right kind of tools, and how to align the phase, how to fix a phase issue, okay? I'm also going to explain why you must understand how every one of your synths that you use to create some sort of sub sound, every synth is a little different in how it handles the phase of the waveforms that it's spitting out of the oscillators, the phase of the oscillators, and phase is very important. It's unless you know what button or knob to look for, you could be putting out a sub that you think sounds great when you listen to it alone, but you mix it with the kick and it's just going to screw everything up, right? Because the phase won't stay aligned. I'm also going to go into some serious detail about sidechain ducking, why all the shapes you've been learning on YouTube are wrong, why using compressors and dynamic EQs for ducking is the wrong way to go about it, despite what FabFilter or other people with their new whiz-bang dynamic EQ points will tell you. And compressors are just not the best way to duck. There's a whole class of duckers that work by volume shaping in a much slower and different way than a compressor does. And these are the best way to do ducking by far, and I'm going to demonstrate how they work and why they're superior. Finally, I'm going to also be showing you a little bit about how to use oscilloscopes, and you will need a good oscilloscope for this technique, but don't worry. There's at least one good, cheap, actually free if you want it to be, oscilloscope out there that'll get the job done. And of course, Bitwig has a native oscilloscope that's just fantastic and works great for this purpose. So if you use Bitwig, you're covered. If you don't use Bitwig, there's a free oscilloscope you can get your hands on that'll work well for this. And if you want to, it's kind of an honor VST, like, okay, we won't force you to pay us, but we'll nag you a little bit until you do pay us. It's one of those things, and it's only $25. And then finally, I'm going to be explaining a lot about, you'll hear about how low-pass filters or shelving filters or high-pass filters or any kind of pass filter will mess up phase, right? And honestly, when you do filters higher in the spectrum, that phase change is not really that big of an issue. But down in the low end, the real low end, where the subs live, where your kick and your sub live, When you have a filter on anything that's affecting that region, oh yeah, big problems. Phase issues are a big problem. And again, I'm going to show you how these mess up the phase and how to hear it and how to fix it. All right, so before I go to the next slide, let's just do a quick demo just to tease you and help you understand where we're going. I have a project with a single kick and a single sub, and this is a meaty, thumpy kick like you would hear in a lot of festival-oriented bass music genres. Because in the short form, 2-minute, 3-minute songs that always start with an intro to build tension and then a build up, and then they slam into this heavy drop where you just want to make everyone grab the rails and headbang, right? And then you have a breakdown, a chill out period, then another big ass drop, maybe 2 more drops, right? And then you have your outro. And the idea in most of these big festival oriented songs, the dance EDM genres like, dubstep, not so much D&B, right? But like dubstep, rhythm, future bass, to some extent trap, certain types of trap songs, any kind of left field bass. The kick is the only thing that's providing any sort of heavy, thumpy sub energy to all the sections in your song that aren't the drops, right? And when the drops come in, you want those subs to just hammer home, but you don't want to lose all that low end energy entirely when you're in the other parts of the song besides the drops. So this is a very typical kind of kick for those genres, mid-tempo bass like res, whatever. So it's kind of knocky. It knocks a little bit. It's got a little bit of a transient pop, but it's also got a thump and a body, and that body lasts for a little bit, right? So that's going to carry the bottom end in the early part of a song. Now that's fine, except when you pair it with a sub, bad things happen. And I'm going to show you how to recognize the bad things and fix the bad things. And so here's a typical sub that might go with this. This is a very clean sub. It's not an 808. Again, let's pretend you're writing a mid-tempo song or a dubstep-y type song. And this is the typical kind of clean sounding sub you would typically use. Okay. Now, let's also talk about the gain staging relationship or the leveling relationship between those two sounds, because you always want a certain kind of relationship between your kick and your sub. The kick is hitting at roughly -12 dB. That's typically where I like to start in a mix. So if I go look at the VU meter for the channel and we play this, right? So it's hitting about 12.8. I'm not going to mess with it. I could kick it up to 12, but we'll leave it there. And then the sub is going to be hitting about 6 decibels lower than that in peak. So it should be, the sub will be hitting at -18 or thereabouts, right? So it's close to -18. So when you play them together, they sound like this. All right, so that is a typically good, in the ballpark relationship between your kick and your sub. It's just a good rule of thumb at the start of a project. Wherever you like to set your kick in your gain staging structure, I like to use -12 for the kick, and that's like the anchor for my entire mix, even early on in the project. And a lot of us, especially the people that have been trained, by my particular set of mentors, we'll put the sub at 6 dB below that to start with. Now, when you get to mixing and mastering, you're going to adjust that relationship a little bit. Depending on everything else that's happening in the song, you might need to make it only a 4 dB difference between the kick and the sub. You might need to keep it around 6. You might drop it down to a 7 dB difference or even an 8 dB difference. It just depends on how heavy you want the bottom of your song, especially when the drops hit. But the 6 is, a good median starting point, and this is the general kind of feel and relationship you want. Okay, so now, stop that. Let's show you how bad things can go. Oh, and by the way, these are both tuned to an F, right? So they're both the same pitch. The root key of this song would be written in F. Kick is tuned exactly to F, sub's tuned exactly to F, and here's where problems can happen. I'm going to play this track for you, and I want you to tell me if you can hear a problem. Don't tell me. See if you can hear a problem. Listen to this for a second. I'm just going to play this just like this. Okay, the problem's plain as day if you know what to listen for, if you've trained yourself how to listen for it. In case you haven't, let's try this one, which is in much better shape. And let's see if you can hear why this one sounds really good. And now what I'm going to do is flip back and forth between these two. That's why I set this up in what Bitwig calls a selector rack. It's like a whole bunch of different processing racks with things hidden inside them. And I can just toggle back and forth by clicking these little yellow lights. So watch as I jump back and forth between this good one and this bad one, and see if you can hear the difference. Try to really hear the difference. So we'll start with the good one. Okay, so if you hear a difference, congratulate yourself if you can hear a difference between those two tracks, because you're ahead of the game so far. If you know why you're hearing a difference, and you actually could explain what is wrong with this particular sub and kick, it's the same exact sub and kick, just slightly different treatment of the thing. If you can explain what's wrong, then you're in really good shape, right? But I'm gonna really lay this out for you now. For the people who can't really hear the difference or don't really know why, maybe they can hear that they don't like this as much as this one, but they're not sure why. I'm going to lead you into this slowly and show you how this all works. So we're going to use a spectrogram and a level meter. And I'm going to play the bad one, this first combination here. And I want you to watch let me make sure this is 2D. Yeah, so this is a typical 2D spectrogram like you might have in Wave Candy or of course Insight. And a lot of you may have seen or used 2D spectrograms. So I want you to watch the kick and sub area down towards the bottom of the spectrogram. And I also want you to pay attention to what happens to the RMS values right here. Okay, so this is the bad one. All right, I'm going to stop that. So I froze the spectrogram at a certain point, and a lot of people have spectrograms, don't know how to read them. Spectrograms like this, a 2D spectrogram, makes certain things hard to see. But there's something different between these three hits of the kick and the sub. Can you see it? Can you see what's different? Honestly, I bet most of you can't. But if you look really, really close, there's a teeny little divot right here at the very bottom. This here has a little shadow in this bright white yellow section. There's a little shadow here on this one side of it, right? This one looks more solid all the way across. So I'm going to play this bad one a little bit more. And yeah, let me turn the ducker off. It'll be a lot more apparent now. This will make it a lot more apparent, and you'll be able to hear the difference more completely. So the changes will get a little more drastic here, and you'll probably see even more variance in the RMS now that I'm not ducking the sub to the kick at all. So again, watch down here and look specifically for little shadows or blips down here, and look at the RMS value. Come on, play. Oh, gotta do that. See that shadow? Okay. So you notice how these RMS values were bouncing around between like -4.6 to -8 to -7 to -6. I mean, that's a huge difference in RMS, right? Every hit was a slightly different amount of RMS energy. And down here, it's a little hard to see, but you can see that little divot right there. Boink, boink, boink. And you'll notice that when you see these tiny little divots show up, and the RMS goes much lower than usual, like -7, -8. The kick sounds hollower, the bottom end sounds hollower. We lose bottom end, everything sounds hollow, and the timbre is changing from kick to kick. So again, let's not look at this for a minute. Get this out of the way. I want you to just stop that isotope. I want you to just listen for a second. Hear how on those last two hits especially, the timbre just changed and it got a little more hollow, and the thump, the bottom end, just dropped out entirely? That's what phase issues in the low end sound like. And now, phase issues on a meter will also correspond to a constantly different RMS all the time. 8, 4.8, 8.0, 7.2, 6.1. Right? Look at those values jumping around. Now, before I show you an even better meter, let's go back here and let's go to the good sub and kick combination. Now watch how the RMS value stays rock solid, the same exact thing every time, and you hear that consistency of energy and timbre in every single hit. It's always basically 4.1 or 4.0. Let's go back to the bad one. Hear how every time it got thinner sounding and the timbre changed, that you were seeing a lower RMS value, like -8 instead of -4. So this is one way to realize you have a phase issue. Solo your kick and your sub and watch an RMS meter. That's one way. If it's rock solid and stays the same value every single time, chances are you don't have a phase issue. Now there's other good ways I'm going to show you, but this is one of the tricks for seeing it. Got to learn to hear it. You got to learn to recognize when a meter's reminding you that there might be a phase problem you're not paying attention to. And then if you're fortunate enough to have Isotope Insight, they have a great 3D spectrogram. I'm zoomed in really close just on the sub-region here, but this is what it looks like in a 3D kind of view. Let's unpause it. Now this is a good one. This is the good sub. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the bad sub. You can tell because of that big notch right there. Let's let this run a little longer. Look at that notch. Look at the difference right here in this top bright row. See those notches? See that? Wow. Some are good and some are bad, like that. And oh my gosh, that one, right? So let's flip over to the good one and watch the same thing. See how it's just identically shaped every single time? Stopping this monster. Okay, so, you know, this is literally the first 3 or 4 harmonics of the sub. right here. And then this is the kick, which extends all the way up. That's why we hear all the nice mid-range and high-frequency stuff. And the body of the kick has a few more harmonics than this particular sub does, okay? If I were to scroll way out on this, you can kind of see what the whole graph looks like. And we can tilt it, move it around, and do all kinds of stuff, right? You can look at it from different angles. But this was the most useful one for seeing the energy difference, because this is where the kick meets the sub. There's no side chaining yet, so it sits a little higher. And then wherever there's phase interference, you get this notch, this decrease in energy. Now let's explain what's causing that drop in energy. We're going to go back to the bad sub. We're going to come over here to a new channel where I've got some oscilloscopes set up. So let's kind of explain this, because now we need to talk about the oscilloscopes. All right, Bitwig has a native oscilloscope that's just fantastic. This is what it looks like in its view down here. I'm going to stop playback. And what we have here is the orange signal is the kick, and the blue signal is the sub. And I can actually turn those up a little bit to make them easier to see. Let's turn it down a little bit. This is just scaling the scope. But you can see that the orange kick is the same exact location every single time the kick hits. Like there's its first transient right there where my arrow is, and here's the transient phase, and then it slows down. Let's just turn off the sub entirely and let you see the kick. Right? Kick is identical every time, and it's lined up because of my settings here to just, always start right at the transient of the kick. It's being triggered by the transient of the signal that's in channel A, which is the kick, flowing into this. If you're not familiar with Bitwig, and I'm sure your DAW has something similar, I hope your DAW has something similar. If not, you can use the track routing. You notice up here in the track routing, I have no input and no output. And over here, I have a MILDA utility that's taking the volume of this channel all the way down to negative infinity, to pure silence. Because I don't want any sound flowing through this video, I just want to use it for oscilloscopes. So the very first device I have in here is a Bitwig device called an audio receiver. It's like a virtual patch cable. It lets me take audio from anywhere in my project, any track, anywhere, any specific plugin and its output. I can basically tap it like I would a sidechain and say, where do I want the input from? So my drum is coming out of a drum machine called EXO that I love, and I'm just grabbing the post fader signal of this entire EXO track, right? And here's EXO if you've never seen it before. It's just completely awesome. It is my default drum machine now, and I'm just playing this kick out of EXO. Okay, so I've tapped the audio at the post fader signal of the EXO track, and I basically said, bring that into this track. That's the thing I want running through this track. And so this oscilloscope, by default, in its A channel, the color A or orange, is picking up the kick. And so it just picks up the kick, right? Now, this is a dual channel oscilloscope, and I can have a different signal that's either like, okay, right now I'm looking at the mid of the kick. I could try and also look at the side of the kick with a blue line here. And you can see that this kick is straight down the middle. There is no side signal. I could say, let me see the left of the kick and the right of the kick, and they're identical. So you can see the blue and the orange are actually overlapped on each other, right? And then what I can really do that's cool is let's go back to the mid of the kick. And over here, there's an external sidechain. And if I choose this one, I can say, I can basically sidechain any other signal from anywhere else in my project into this thing. So what I've done here is I've said, go to Sublab, which is the track that's generating the sub. Go to Sublab, and I want you to give me the post fader output from Sublab, because I want to hear and see the two signals at their balanced level of -12 and -18 dB, right? So if I do it post fader, I'll get that balanced signal. So Sublab post is the sidechain input here, and therefore when I superimpose the two signals, I get blue for the sub and orange for the kick. And if I set the kick back down to 0, this is their actual volume, right? All right. Now, oh my gosh, I don't have Bitwig, you say. Well, don't worry about it. There is one oscilloscope out there that will get the job done for you, and it's called Shope. This is what it looks like. It's made by Schwa. This is a free demo version I have right now. And let me briefly show you this. This is what their site looks like. You can download a demo that's fully functional, and they don't play games like turning it off or, putting out intermittent noise. They basically it's on the honor system, and they say, look, if you're going to use this, please pay us 25 bucks. You can buy a license, we'll turn off all the nagware. This is the only scope that does this job well. I've looked at all the other oscilloscopes out there, including a lot of people mentioned Blue Cat Oscilloscope Multi. It's terrible. Don't use it. I mean, it may be good for some things, but it's terrible for this use case because you can't get the waveforms exactly where you want them, even though you can display multiple track waveforms. Bad, bad, bad choice. Don't get it. Another popular one people like is the Oscarizer, and it's also terrible, even though it can display up to 10 different tracks at a time in various different configurations. It's terrible. Don't get it. This is the only one that's going to work for what I'm showing you in this video. So if you don't have an oscilloscope, go out and grab the demo of this one. And if you find that it's useful, pay the person 25 bucks for developing this. Okay, so here's what the same scope looks like in Schwa. You can compare it down here. We've got the white waveform as the kick, the green waveform as the sub. Okay, so either one of these will work. You can learn your way around this one if you decide to use this one. The basic idea is whatever's running into Shope appears in these two channels, and I just turned off one of them, so I'm only looking at probably the left side of the signal. This is probably left and right as a stereo pair. So this one's off. And then this one is whatever you feed into the sidechain input of Shope. So here I'm in the sidechain controller for this VST, and you can see that just like I did over here in Bitwig's native oscilloscope, I just chose the same post fader output from Sublab, and that gets fed into these 2 meters. And again, it's stereo left and right, so I just turned off the blue portion, and that's why I see the sub in green and I see the kick in white. So that's all I'm going to say about this one. You can figure this out if this is the one you end up using. So why does this particular sub sound bad? And I'm going to do another trick here. I'm going to take this and blow it up into its own separate window. And now we can see it slightly bigger up here, and I don't have to stay on this track anymore. I can just poke around where I'm doing all the work. So here's the bad one. And watch what's happening to the blue waveform for the sub every time the kick hits. See how it's constantly drifting? It looks like it's slowly drifting to the left. Now, really what's probably happening is it's a random phase every time, but for a variety of reasons, the randomness is just resulting every quarter note or every half note as drifting exactly that much. So it's not truly random. It's kind of it's a moving phase. It's never the same phase, but it's also not completely random. So that's why it looks like it's slowly drifting to the left. And you'll notice that when the blue and the orange line up, because this is an F, and the orange is also an F down here in the body portion of the kick. When they line up, everything sounds strong and clean and powerful, and that's when the RMS is at its highest. And when they're completely 180-degree opposite to each other, when this blue peak is right in the middle and completely opposite of the orange waveform, everything starts sounding hollow, and the timbre changes and all the subby energy just drops right out of it. So when you're watching this, you're going to be able to hear the phase issues more clearly. And this is a good training tool to teach you how to hear the phase issues. Okay, see how every time the blue is right in the middle and they're canceling each other out like crazy? That's when it sounds bad and hollow and weak. All right, now here's the good sub and kick, and watch what's different about this pairing. All right. So the reason this one sounds good and consistent and always hits at the same exact RMS level is because the phase of both the sub and the kick are perfectly aligned, or at least as perfect as you can get with a kick. Because kicks are a little bit irregular. If you look really carefully at this orange waveform, the peaks are a lot closer together here. That's higher pitch because they're closer together. And so this is where the transient portion of the kick is. And then there's a little bit of a pitch drop in the body. This is a very layered kick. And so there's a slight, but it's very slight. But that pitch drop is why even about here, the peaks start to spread apart, but see that gap's a little closer than this gap, and then this gap's even wider, and then this gap's even wider, and then this gap's even wider. And then finally, when it gets down to about here, is when the gaps start becoming more or less even. And here you're hearing the real F note, the real tone of the kick is all the way out here, right in here. So this is the part that I lined up with the sub, and I didn't worry so much about these being out of phase, although I'll show you why this creates a big problem. All right, so now let's also show you the ducking and what the ducking's doing. Right now there is no ducking, so this is where the sub is hitting. Boom, there's a little bit of a envelope on the sub. Let's show you what the sub looks like real quick. I'm using the most awesome sub creation tool in the world, which is called SubLab. If you find this tool and wrap your head around it, you will never use anything else to make your subs in 808s. It's great. But basically what's happening here is I'm only using the one oscillator they call an X sub. And the reason I like the X sub is it automatically generates harmonics for you. You don't have to do a bunch of post-processing games. Here's kind of what it looks like in their scope. And you can see those little harmonic blips right here. Every time it hits, it does. Basically, this is the second harmonic, this is the third harmonic, and this is a fourth harmonic, or fifth harmonic maybe. This is the fundamental at F0. This is the second harmonic at F1. This is C1. And this is, I think, F2, something like that. That's the harmonic relationship. So it generates some harmonics for you to help it kick through on smaller speakers. And you don't have to play all the games we usually play. Now, you can also play a sample. You can also layer it with a sample. You can also layer it with a variety of synth waveforms and tune the behavioral properties of that synth. But the one thing I wanted to show you was the ADSR envelope for the synth, and even the filter envelope, and even the pitch envelope affect both the synth sound that you may or may not be using. Right now, I'm not using anything. Well, I am, but it's turned off, right? There's no color here, and the volume's all the way down. But these envelopes also affect the sub. So specifically, the volume envelope, I have a little bit of an attack time on here. And because there's a little bit of an attack, that's why you don't see the sub really coming into full signal until about here relative to the kick, even though the MIDI notes are hitting at exactly the same point. Right? You're seeing this is the attack phase right here of the sub. So why does this sub that I'm looking at right now, why does this stay phase locked? And why does the other sub here, why does this one not stay phase locked? They look identical, right? But watch, this is the one that the phase is going to keep drifting around all the time. All right, why is this one doing that? They look identical. All right, to explain this, I need to briefly show you Serum, because almost everyone's familiar with Serum, so we're going to take a quick look at Serum to illustrate the point. More than a few people will use Serum to generate their sub, and some people will do it by just, turning off both of the oscillators and just grabbing the plain vanilla shapes in the subsection and sending it to direct out or not. Whatever, dropping it down an octave, Okay, that's all well and good, but some people don't like those basic shapes. Some people prefer to use more exotic sub shapes that sound a little more analog, right? So you might come here to this oscillator and go to something like analog and use analog BD sine, right? Which if you look at this, it's not a perfect sine wave. It's a little bit skewed. It's a little bit uneven, and that creates a kind of interesting sine wave with a few more harmonics in it, which is why people use it. Let's see, another one might be, where are you, where are you, where are you? It's been so long since I've used Serum for this. I don't know where these are hiding anymore. Is it under? Where are you? Too many damn wavetables. It's not spectral. Where are you? I'm sorry, if I don't find it in 2 more seconds, I'll stop. Maybe it's under classic sense. Nope. Nope. Come on, where's the Juno? There's a Juno sub that people like. All right, I'm drawing a blank. Drawing a blank. Maybe it's this. No, that's a pulse width mod sub. I don't know. I guess. Grr. Maybe it was. No, it wasn't that one. Okay. Well, anyway, the point is, people will grab a basic kind of sub shape that's a little bit unusual. Wavetable position. Yeah. Okay. You know, and they'll find an interesting shape that gives them the sound and the harmonics they want. And then they'll say, great, I got a sub. I'm not going to put a filter on it. I'm not going to do any LFO modulation of it. There's my sub. And they'll turn off Serum and they think they have a sub now. But there's a problem. This little guy right here, this random knob, what does this do? This is a good thing for a lot of things like supersaw sounds and big, sharp, fuzzy, angular, aggressive sounding synths. If you have them always hit exactly the same starting point every single time, it can sound a little monolithic and sharp and kind of transient-y and impacty in ways that may not musically fit what you want. And so I don't want to set up the routing to show you what this does in phase, but just trust me. If you're going to use Serum to be a sub, you got to remember to drag this knob all the way down to 0 phase, because what this does is it forces this thing to play exactly the same phase every single time. If you don't, if it's even slightly up, or it's over here, or it's all the way to the end, this thing is going to start at a different point of its waveform cycle every single time it plays this, every time a note hits this, right? And that is essentially what we're seeing in this particular sublab patch. So let's open this up again and let's play it. You can see this, the phase drifting. It's not hitting in the same spot every time. And why? Well, in sublab, there's a tiny little menu. It's really easy to overlook right here. And one of the options right here is reset the phase on every new note. Now, because that's a choice for me, right now that means it's not resetting the phase or starting on the same exact phase with each new note. If I click this, now we're going to see this hitting perfectly in phase at the same time. Well, not perfectly in phase. The phase isn't moving anymore, right? It's still out of phase. It's out of phase, but it's not moving anymore. It's staying put. And that's because if we look at it now, it says don't reset phase on every new note. Okay, so I've shown you 2 synthesizers you could potentially use to make subs, and I'm pointing out that almost any synthesizer that creates sub sounds may or may not give you an option to lock the phase so that it hits exactly the same every single time. And if it does give you that option, you need to make sure it's selected to keep the phase hitting exactly the same every time, okay? So that's how you fix sublab, and I showed you how to fix Serum, and other synthesizers will have a similar kind of thing in them somewhere. Okay, so the next thing to note. We've locked the phase for this one formerly bad sub generator, right? It's locked now, but it's still out of phase. So how do we fix the phase, right? I've shown you how to hear when they're out of phase. I've shown you a couple ways to see when they're out of phase, right? Now, how do we align the phase? For this, you need an oscilloscope. You need to be able to look at the actual waveform. And the other tool you need is hiding here in this particular rack right here. I was keeping it hidden from you. You need something in your DAW that will allow you to adjust the latency or time shifting of the entire track. Now, in Ableton, there's a little button you can toggle somewhere in Ableton, and way over here on this side of the Ableton window, over on the right side, there'll be this tiny little column that opens up that lets you set a millisecond delay value for the track, and just either make the track a few milliseconds late relative to every other track, or make the track a few milliseconds early relative to every other track in the project. And when you push it earlier than every other track, what the DAW is really doing under the covers is delaying every other track. It's doing plug-in delay compensation to like keep everything matched up and in sync. Now, Bitwig has the same thing, but they do it as a special utility device they call time shift. Here's what it looks like in the list of Bitwig devices. It's way down here, and it's called time shift, right? So when you bring time shift in, one advantage of Bitwig's approach to time shifting is that you can put it anywhere you want in the track, which lets you play fun games. Like I could have a time shift early in my track processing and like throw something, or I could have a parallel rack with the time shift on one of the channels of the parallel rack, and I could throw the signal slightly out of phase with the other channel and do some special processing, and then at the end bring it back into phase. I mean, there's all kinds of tricks you can play because you can put multiples of these on your processing racks and do all kinds of crazy things. This doesn't have to be necessarily at the end of the track. I've got it fairly early in the track before my duckers. It doesn't matter. All I really want to do is just take this sub signal and shift it. So here's how you shift it. I could either go early and move everything to the left, move this blue waveform leftward. That would be moving it earlier. Or I can push it on the other side of 0 and make it late and push it in the other direction to the right. Now, typically I don't like pulling one track early and incurring plug-in delay compensation on every other track in my project. So typically I will try to go and delay or time shift to the right first. And in this case, especially since we're going to be side chaining out what's happening at the beginning here, it doesn't really matter if I take the starting point of this waveform and push it to the right a little bit. So my goal here is to take these blue peaks right here and line them up with these orange peaks right here. So you have to do that while the oscillator is running and the sound is running. So watch what I do here. And that's about where I would set this, especially since I'm going to be side chaining all this out later. Now, you'll notice the kick's F tone isn't perfectly lined up with the sub's F tone. The sub is a perfect F tone because it's a synthesizer, right? Kicks have a lot of phase issues and pitch drops, and they could be organically recorded. And so there's a little bit of waffling in the pitch at various places. So if I were going to layer these two things together without side chaining, I might pull this back to the left just a little bit and focus here where the real kick body first starts. So I might line it up more like this. And let these be a little bit out of phase, because this is what the ear is going to pick up earliest and quickest and hear as the two things being in phase with each other. But the point is, you use some sort of time shifting utility or feature in your DAW, and every DAW is going to have something like this, to just visually line them up. Now, The next thing we need to talk about is ducking. So let me put on the good ducking shape first. This is the best of the ducking shapes, and we're going to spin into ducking soon. But first, I want to show you, you want to understand how to see the coherence of your phase and how to adjust the coherence left or right with some sort of time shifting to get them lined up where they need to be lined up. Now, as soon as I turn on a ducker, this is going to change a little bit. All right, so now I have a ducking shape that's basically taking the sub down to almost nothing during the transient of the kick. And then as it moves out of its pitch drop phase and starts moving into its body ring out, the sub starts slowly fading up. And then right about here, here's the level of the sub, and you'll see that it's almost kind of sort of, you know, following the tail of the kick and staying at roughly the same energy as the ending of the tail of the kick. Now, because I've dipped these down quite a bit, they're still out of phase, but they're not phase canceling or phase interfering with these kick peaks nearly as much as when it wasn't ducked. So here, we have a lot of potential interference right through here, and we definitely have some interference happening here, okay? But when we duck it, you don't have to worry about the interference here because this is so much less energy conflicting with the kick. So now my focus is really how does the kick's tail blend into the sub? And so I want to line these up here. And right about, oh, a little bit more to the right. Right about there is a good happy medium. I'm a little bit late here, but not too much. I'm still mostly in the center of the kick. And here I'm just about right on. And then here you can see the kick is still sort of dropping in pitch as it fades out, but the sub is staying consistent. So here the sub starts being a little early compared to the kick. So I would probably stick with this or maybe push it just a tiny bit more, just to really let the tail of the sub merge with the end of the kick, right? I could live with that too. The point is you want to be in this ballpark and you want to focus more where the sub is finally coming up to full energy and make sure that's phase coherent with whatever's happening in the kick. And sometimes, you know, you have to do some compromise. It won't be perfect, but get it close. Okay, so let's pause for a minute and look at what just happened. When there wasn't any ducking, I needed a different time shift value than when there is ducking. So that's a thing to keep in mind. A lot of things in your attention to detail for sound production boils down to iterations on a basic technique or concept. If you make one change in one place in your project, it might affect what you've done in some other places. And so you have to remember to go check it again, right? And this is an example. If I had early on said, oh my God, this kick and this sub are totally out of phase with each other before I had set up any ducking, right? Because a lot of times we won't set up ducking until much later in the project lifecycle. Like when we're in mixdown is when we start really thinking hard about ducking. So I might have set up the timing, the phase coherence with a different time shift value early on in my project. And then when I get to mixdown and I start applying the ducker, it's easy to forget to go back and check, well, now that I've applied some ducking, is my phase coherence still good, right? Or do I need to adjust it a little bit? So at the point in mixdown where I finally have nailed my ducking shape and I'm getting the sound I want, I might be coming back and tweaking the time shift a little bit, just a little bit to line it up better with my duct shape. And so that's a really important thing to remember as a type of attention to detail step or checklist item when you're doing your mixdown stuff. As soon as you apply your ducker, go back and check your phase, okay? So what else do we want to talk about before I move on from here? So we've covered all this, how to see it, hear it, align it. We've talked about how different synths will handle the way that they do phase differently, and you have to look for a control for that. And now we're going to start going heavy into ducking. But before I go into ducking, let me show you why high pass filters or shelving filters on your kick will, again, maybe require you to come back and mess with your phase. So let's say, just for the sake of example, you've done some ducking, you're in your mix, you're way in the end of your mix down phase, and you're just deciding, you know, for whatever reason, the kick just isn't, it's still a little too heavy. Maybe I want to take that bottom end out a little bit. Or maybe I want to make it knock a little harder by putting a notch filter or peak filter somewhere in the spectrum and increase the area where it knocks. Maybe you use a transient shaper to just tweak your kick a little more to just really sit just the way you want it in a really busy mix. So let's simulate that real quick. Keeping the same kick. I haven't ever changed the kick. It's been the constant thing going on here, right? But let's put in a transient shaper, and let's use kilohertz transient shaper. Where are you? Hiding under here? There you are. Okay, so we're going to play with the kick now, and we're just going to do it by ear, but watch what happens over here as I do it by ear. I'm going to try not to look at this. Actually, I'm going to hide it for a second. So let's listen to the kick. All right, let's say I wanted it slightly more attacky, a little bit less body sustain. I wonder if that did anything to our phase. Let's find out. Well, in this case, it's a pretty well-designed transient shaper. Oh, okay, where's my ducking? Where the heck is my ducking? Let's come back here and make sure the ducking's on. That's right, I turned it off. So here's what it looks like post-ducking. So in this case, this is a pretty damn good transient shaper because it's not messing with my phase all that much. Let's take this in a different direction. Let's make it a little more boomy and see if that messes with the phase at all. No, not so much. It's actually a really well-designed transient shaper. Let's try something different. Let's go here and put in an EQ. Too many pros to toggle down to. All right, so let's say I want to, I don't know, put a low shelf on my kick and just take a little bit of the thud out of the kick. I want to maybe try, my goal might be to emphasize the, that's a notch filter. My goal might be to emphasize the sub a little more, just take a little bit of the boom out of the kick because, I don't know, in my breakdown or build up, I feel like the kick's too heavy. And it's just, at this point, rather than replacing the kick, it's easier to just come and EQ the kick a little bit, right? So what happens over here when I start messing with the shelf? Can you see it? Can you see what it's doing? See how the orange lines are moving a little bit off of the blue lines, depending on where this is sitting? Just a little bit. Now they're in phase. Now as I put it about here and try and drop this a little bit, so those orange lines start shifting just a tiny amount. It's kind of faint here, but let's do the real culprit, which is a high pass, right? Let's say you're doing this to, okay, for example, everyone says, okay, you should remove all energy below 20 hertz, right? So let's put this up to 20 hertz. Let's see if that affects the phase at all. Oh yeah, see that shift? See how the orange stuff has moved apparently leftward from where it was before? Watch, I'm gonna turn off this low pass. See how these are lined up? Right? These are lined up perfectly. Now watch what happens when I turn this low pass on. No longer lined up. See that? Right there? Now look at this. This is a simple 12 dB. It's the most gentle high pass I can make. And it's sitting all the way down at 20 hertz. It's way below where my supposed sub range is, right? So why is it messing up the phase of my kick? Why is it pulling the kick out of phase coherence with the sub? Well, it's doing it because any kind of pass filter does a 180-degree phase shift, and it isn't just where the filter point is. You see this whole knee going on up here, all the way up to basically where E1 is, where roughly 30 or 40 or 50 kilohertz is. We've got a phase shift right through here, a big fat phase shift, and that causes the kick fundamentals to actually move, or I'm sorry, the pitch of the waveform to move. So when you come in and you follow the rules that you learned in a YouTube video or your mentor taught you, says always high pass everything at 20. Get rid of as much sub energy as you can, because all that sub energy will mess up your mastering. Okay, that's true. And this actually might be a good move to make on the kick and on the sub too. I might even come over to the sub and make this same move. But when you make this kind of simple adjustment to help your total low end energy be more manageable for the mastering limiter, you have to remember, crap, I just put an EQ filter on something that lives down in my sub range. If I do that, I need to come over and recheck my phase again. So I could leave this filter on here as long as I come back over to Sublab, well, wherever my time shift is, and I adjust the time shifting one more time. Okay, this is attention to detail territory. You do all these things, you have this checklist of things you do because, I'm supposed to do it, or you understand and you know why you might want to do it, but you don't think about the downstream effects of doing it. And this is the other gotcha. So when you put a filter on your kick or your sub, especially of a high pass nature, shelf was less of an effect. That's why a lot of mastering engineers, like if you go watch isotope videos about mastering, you're going to see, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, I forgot your name, but the person who does all of their videos, they'll come in here and they'll drop some energy in the unnecessary super low regions of the thing, but they use a shelf filter. And they'll even explain why they use a shelf filter, because it does less phase damage down here. So I've switched this back to a shelf. The shelf is at 20 hertz again. I'm going way down, like, 4.5 decibels. Watch, the phase is going to be much better when I start playing this. And let's turn this on again. Okay, watch the phase. See how the phase is better? That phase shift isn't quite as drastic. It's still there a little bit. If I turn this off, you're going to see this peak here move over just a bit. Just a teeny bit though, right? So it barely moves the phase compared to a low pass. So, maybe this is a better way to take care of some energy in your sub region, because you're not messing your phase up nearly as much, right? And another thing you're going to hear over and over, okay, don't do this, don't do that, don't make it really sharp, it's going to mess up your phase. Well, okay, yes, it's true. Even notch filters, bell filters like this, they do mess with your phase. But phase shifts up here are no biggie. I mean, every EQ colors the sound. When you phase shift, you're just changing the color, the timbre. And stuff up here, little phase shifts aren't a big deal, right? There's just nothing like the big deal you have down in the sub region. So it's only down here you really have to think hard and worry about phase shifts and come back and check your phase. All right, so that's enough on that subject. Let's go back and just get rid of this so it's not a factor. And now let's talk about the fun part, which is sidechaining. You thought that this took time? No, we're going to get into sidechaining, and I'm not going to break it apart into a different video because it goes hand in hand with all the stuff I'm showing you here. So now we're going to go look at this with the ducking off, right? So there's no ducking. This is just the attack envelope, the 9 millisecond attack envelope of the sub itself. That's why there's no sub here. And actually, there's also a 16.8 millisecond shift where I pushed this whole blue waveform to the right, right? So that's why we have a little bit of a gap here before the sub actually starts. If I duck it, you don't notice it as much because the ducking itself is reducing all that same energy here. But now let's talk about the ducking itself. The waveform, I'm going to hide this from you for a second. Let's just put it down here. And I'm going to play 3 different ducking shapes. back to back. And I want you to see if you can hear why I believe this shape is by far the best ducking shape. It's the best result on the waveform. So just using your ears, listen really close. This is the good one. Now here's one that's slightly worse. Here's one that's way worse. Let's listen to him again. I'm going to go back and forth, especially between C and A, and see if you can hear the difference. All right. So I'm hoping you can hear the difference, right? It's pretty obvious. You can hear that A has this, it sounds like overall it's the same volume and the same amount of sub energy, but you hear this boom, 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 boom in the background. And watch the meter and listen for that boom, boom, boing. Now that you've fixed that in your mind and you've noticed how fast this goes up and then jumps really quick to the top. Up, fast. Now listen to this one and watch the meter over here. Hear how there's no boom, boom, boom. And also this meter was just very slowly and lazily moving up at a slow, kind of constant linear pace. Right? And then this one's kind of in the middle. You can hear a little bit of that swell up afterwards, right? Now, all of these are ducked using a tool called Duck, which is my absolute favorite ducking utility. It's a volume shaper. This is the shape. Let's make sure I'm actually looking at the right one. This is the shape that was real boingy. So yeah, look at this shape here. This is the typical ducking shape you see everyone do in their YouTube videos. Oh, look how to use volume shaper. Oh, look how to use duck. Oh, look how to use Nicky Romero kick, right? Or LFO tool, make a shape like this in LFO tool. And in fact, it's very close to this ducking shape right here, this preset ducking shape. Just a little more curved, a little more gradual. But listen to this. And you can see that same bouncy jump over here in the output meter. What's happening, if you look in the background, this gray thing is the sub waveform, and so you can see how much it's being attenuated. And you can see how rapidly it increases in amplitude once it starts coming in. And here's the deal. Our ears and our brains are really sensitive to tiny, tiny, tiny volume differences in the sub. You know, you hear this general rule of thumb, you don't hear a sound difference, most people, unless it's at least 3 dB louder. And then maybe sound engineers and producers will hear something that's 1 dB louder because we've trained our ears. But the sub, oh my gosh, there's so much energy in the sub that a sloping upward like this is incredibly fast, and you hear it as this va-voom, 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 right? It's just bouncing. And yet, I guarantee you, at least some of the people watching this video slap on a ducking shape like this and they think, okay, the transient of my kick is about this long, and everyone tells me I'm supposed to duck out during the transient of my kick so that I can hear my kick through the mix. And so my kick and sub, you know, I can hear my kick through the sub, and the sub's not masking my kick. And they just put this tiny little, like, you know, they'll move this thing way over here and make a shape more like that, right? And they'll think that's a good ducking slice because that's how long my transient is. And if you use a compressor to do your ducking, chances are the compressor is doing a ducking shape about this narrow too by the time you set up the compressor the way all the videos tell you to set up a compressor and filter the trigger signal, the sidechain signal, and find the clicky part of the kick so that your ducking slice is as small as possible. And they'll tell you all this stuff that results in this really tiny little thing that makes the volume go suddenly ba-voom, ba-voom, and it just sounds bad. I mean, this is going to be there subliminally, and then other people are going to notice it. All right, so let's look at the next shape, which was more like this. Now this one has a much more gentle kind of slope, and I've got a few little control points in here to shape, but what I was really trying to do was shape a more gradual rise of the sub energy. So let's listen to this one. All right, it's better. It's certainly better than the last one, but it's still got a little bit of that pumping ba-room, 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 right? Doing, 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 doing. You hear it. You hear this ringing. Now, let's look at this one, and let's listen to this one. Put them side by side. Hey, they look kind of the same. Why does this one sound so good? In fact, the shape of the wave looks kind of similar to this one. Let's flip back over here, and now we're going to watch this meter. See, the shape looks about the same. Why does this one sound so much better? And the answer is because this shape is occurring over twice as long of a time scale. Look very closely over here. This window is set to show me a quarter note. From here to here is a quarter note. That's the speed value right here. At a quarter note, that means each of these blips is a 16th note, right? 16, 16, 16, 16, quarter note. This one, however, is set at a speed of a half note for the window. In other words, this volume envelope will go for as long as a full half note if I want it to. From here to here is a half note. So this is an eighth, 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 eighth. 2/8 is a quarter, 2/8 is a quarter, half, right? Same shape, but it's taking literally twice as long to play out. And also, I'm not dropping the volume completely to the floor. It's a little bit above infinity. See, this one's down at infinity, but this one here is a little bit higher up. Now, why did I do this, and why does this sound better? Again, it revolves around the fact that our ears are incredibly sensitive to any kind of volume change in the subregion. We're really, really super highly sensitive to it. So what this looks like in the oscilloscope, oh, I just hid you down here. All right, what this looks like in the oscilloscope is this, right? Look at how I've started a little bit of sub energy down here. I haven't taken it quite all the way to the floor. This little flat line is because of my timing, my time shift delay. But then when the sub actually hits, it comes in with a teeny bit of volume, pretty much right from the start. It doesn't go all the way to the floor. And you can see that reflected here, kind of. And then it slowly fades up, cross-fades in, and it's a smooth cross-fading so we don't hear a boing. And most importantly, this last part of the shape, this is a little bit less than a half note. This meter's kind of cutting it off before a full half note. This is still ducking. This part of the ducker is still in effect, even through here, way over here, way after the end of the kick. Now, why? Well, let's go back to this ducking shape. And let's pull it up. Let's just superimpose it a little bit here. So watch this one and watch what happens here that's looking a little different. Okay, it's a subtle difference, but you notice how the kick tapers down and then it stays down where it meets the sub, but then you can even see, even at this magnification, you can see that it's rising up slightly here. Okay, so it's going down and then up. Now let's go back to this other kick, this other ducker. Watch this area right here. See how it's much more of a consistent flat line, and it doesn't start picking up again until about right here. And even that's just because I stopped it, right? So it goes down to flat, and see where I stop it, it kind of hops up again for a second, but it stays flat all the way across here. Now, if I were to go to my oscilloscope, and let's close these for a second. Let's increase the scale a little bit here. Yeah. This is more of a macro view. So sub fades up slowly, cross fades nicely as the kick's energy is coming down. Then it stays very consistent for a long time, and then finally the sub itself, its long decay tail starts decaying down, and then we have the next hit starting the cycle over again. This is a smooth progression. Smooth. That's why we're not hearing a boing. If I flip back over to the other ducking shape, actually, yeah, let's use the really grotesque one. Look at that. Kicks going down, then sudden whoosh, swell up of the sub, and then it tapers down and starts sounding good. But this part is the big bounce we're hearing. Okay, and then this one that's pretty good, but still not quite right. Here you can see it a little better, what I was trying to describe before. See how there's a little dip down and then it swells up again right here? If I make this a little bit bigger by doing this. Okay, now you can see it even more clearly. Kick's moving in this direction, volume's fading. Volume's cross-fading up on the sub, but there's this little bit of a dip where the sub is low here, but keeps rising after the kick drops off. So we hear this meeting, but there's still a little bit of a pump up. And again, if we go to our really, really good sidechaining shape, look at that. That's perfect because the kick comes down, subs coming up, they're cross-fading nicely with a similar kind of overall energy level. And then right where the kick is really starting to drop off and the sub's taking over, the sub just stays nice and flat for a while and then drops down. So where I'm going with this, and the thing I really, really, really wanted to point out in extreme detail, was those shapes you've been learning on YouTube are just wrong. They're wrong, wrong, wrong. You need, for a sub and kick, especially a really fat kick, you need a sub that is rather a ducking shape that looks a lot more like this and goes up very gradually over a long time span. Again, the total distance of this entire envelope is a half note. So this entire ducking shape is lasting for the duration of a full quarter note. And that's what keeps this consistent. And so when you're making your ducking shape, the first thing I want you to do is start with a bigger window than you might normally do by default. Try something like, a window that's a half note long, and make your duck last over the entire length of at least a full quarter note, right? And really play with the points and the shape on your line to don't use your eyes quite as much as your ears, and listen for that swelling boing, 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 right? And just adjust the line and play with the shapes. You're going to want it to come up a little faster at first to crossfade in because the kick's coming down, and then you're going to want to slow down the crossfade and the level rise, and you're just going to have to play with the shape and find a shape you want. But this is not a typical ducking shape you see people do on YouTube. And yet this is the right ducking shape for this particular kick and this particular sub. They just sound like one unit now. And if I turn off the kick and turn on the sub, here's another way to hear it. Let's play the kick just by itself. That's what the kick looks like. And when I turn on the sub, the kick sounds exactly the same in both cases. There's no timbral change. The kick is the kick. The sub is not interfering with the kick. Right? Now, by contrast, if I pick this other ducking shape and we do that same soloing of the kick, right? So the kick is still pretty much the same because through the transient and pitch drop portion of its envelope, I've ducked out all the sub, right? There's nothing interfering here, but you know, depending, you might even hear a timbral change in the kick. So this is all about the ducking shape. Now, the next thing to talk about is not how the kick and the sub are crossfading into each other, but instead, we want to look at the other part of this slide that I tried pointing out, which is that the kick sub relationship is that those two sounds together are basically one sound when they happen at the same time. They are the low end, they should live in the mid channel, but here's the key. They become one continuous single waveform when a limiter or clipper is looking at them. And that single waveform looks really different than either of the two original waveforms. So let's briefly take a look at that. Now we're going to do that by closing this oscilloscope down. Now we're going to use one that's over on my master channel. Let's get this opened up. Stop that. Where are you? On my other screen? The hell are you? Oh, let's just do it this way. There we go. All right. Oh, I think I had it hiding down here somewhere. Okay. So here's the kick by itself. Let's just solo the kick. Nice big waveform. And let's do this to sort of, well, let's do it in a different spot. Okay, now it's locked. So the way this works in Bitwig is this is free running. And then since this is almost a half a bar long, the length of this window, if I kick it into every quarter note trigger, like directly on the grid beat of every quarter note, if I do it when the waveform's over here, it's going to lock to the center because this is basically a quarter note somewhere around here, but this is the other quarter note being shown in this window. So what I have to do is while it's free running, I have to kick it into the beat locked mode when it's closer to the left side, and then it'll snap over here and start doing this. So this just lets us look at the kick very closely. So you can see here's the big transient. It's got a nice triangular shape, and I'll explain later why this is important, but just to show you briefly, when I come, oh, and here's the sub by itself. And again, let's do the game where we try to lock it, although it's a very long sub. There we go. So there's the sub. And then when we combine both of them together, we get a very different thing. Okay, look at this shape compared to just the kick alone. Remember how the kick was a triangle that stopped about here, but this looks very different. And this is the best ducking curve we could come up with. It would look even different with other ducking curves. Let's just let this run while I play different ducking shapes. We'll just let it slide by because it's easier than trying to lock it in. So here's the other ducking shape. See how this looks different now? And here's the bad ducking shape. You can see the big boing, right? And then here's with no ducking at all. Now, let's look at that. You might say, well, that looks pretty good, and it sounds good, and it kind of does sound good. It sounds good because the phase is coherent between the kick and the sub. So here's the kick transient, pitching down, here's the sub, and the part that's all lined up in phase. But notice the difference between the kick without the sub and the kick with the sub. Kick alone, kick with sub. Without. Let's stop and look at this. See how far the transient is extending? It's stopping just shy of these outer lines right here. That's the peak of the kick. And this is the transient, is the highest, peakiest part. And the body isn't starting until way down here, like under this line. This is where the body is really happening. And here's that final tail ring out that I'm merging with the sub. And the sub is, basically down around this level. Now watch what happens when I combine it without any ducking to the sub. Especially watch these transients and watch what happens to this nice triangular shape. Look at that. This is a nightmare for your limiter and your clippers. This is a nightmare for your mastering. This will fall apart when you master your track. This will turn your low end distorted and mushy and flabby and muddy, and it will take all the energy out of your drops. Why? Because a mastering limiter sees waveforms that look like this. And what it does is, as soon as the highest peak comes along, let's say the threshold was this line here, it's going to see these two peaks and it's going to push them down. That's what a limiter does. It's what a clipper does too, just in a different way. But these are more subby body peaks. This is your sub wave summing with your kick wave. And so this is a sine wave. This is a tonal element. And when you crunch it down, when you crunch a big fat sub down, it just gets nasty and thin. Now, let's say our threshold, our limiter threshold was more like here. Look at all these combined sub and body kick sine waves that it's just going to be crushing, as well as some of the transient stuff over here, right here. Now let's look at the kick one more time just by itself. See that? If we had our master limiter threshold right here, all it's chopping off is mostly a couple of these very sharp transient parts of the kick and just the tiniest little tips of the very first part of the pitch drop of the kick. And you remember with our ducking shape, there's not even any sub energy here yet. The sub doesn't start coming in until here. So when the sub comes in, it's still all sitting here. So again, let's look at this. Here's the kick alone. Here's the kick with the sub, but no ducking. And look at all that boom is just going to get crushed to death by a limiter. And it's going to squeeze all the life out of it and distort it. Now, if we look at how the combined kick and sub look when they're ducked with the correct ducking shape, look at the difference. See that? I could have a mastering limiter threshold at this line, and it's barely touching those sub peaks, barely touching the combined kick body and sub signal. This is how they're summing together. They're safe. I could be chopping off the transients, triggering the limiter, cutting these off a little bit, making them a little brighter and fuzzier, and not really affect the tonal portion of the combined kick and sub, okay? So let's look at this another way briefly. I have a diagram that kind of shows an interesting situation with kicks. Now, this is just about kicks. There's no sub here. There are plenty of kick waveforms you will have in your sample packs that look like this nice triangular shape. This is a different kind of oscilloscope. It's got a peak way up here, and it quickly drops off to a triangle, and here's where the boom or body of the kick is. Starts about here, right? But there's this peak way up here that you can hit with a clipper or limiter, and it's just going to make it sound a little brighter and pleasant and musical and help it even stand out more in the mix when you clip off the transients. And you can bring a limiter or clipper down pretty far and not really affect the boomy body part of the kick that much. Now compare that with this kick. This is a little crunched. It would normally be a little wider. This view captured them a little crunched up, but you're going to have sample packs that are full of kicks that look like this, where there's a transient portion of the kick and then it dips down somewhere near the transient or after the transient, and then it rises way up and has this big fat body up here, or even really big tall peaks, and then it falls down again. This is a terrible, terrible kick for a lot of genres. It'll work okay in very sparse genres that rely on only the kick and then a whole lot of space and then maybe some high-end stuff. Like a lot of hip-hop tunes will have a kick that could be really heavy, and then there's almost nothing else happening in the mid-range or lower mids except for the vocals. And then most of the other energy in the track is happening way up high. So you got this big heavy kick holding out the bottom, you've got a bunch of high sounds holding out the highs, and that's where the music is. And then the vocalist fills in the middle. So this kind of kick shape can work in certain genres like hip hop, or 808s can often look similar to this, where there's just this big distorted boomy 808 tail and then kind of a muffled thuddy transient, right? And again, 808s are so sparse. Trap tune with an 808 is really sparse, and that 808 just rings out, and that's your entire bottom end. So the point is, sometimes kicks like this are okay in certain genres, but if you're going to be mixing together a kick and a sub in genres like dubstep and so on and so forth, mid-tempo bass, rhythm, you need kicks that look a lot more like this, because then you can blend and crossfade a sub into it, and the sub's going to continue out way down here, and then you can use your limiter and clipper to shave off the transients of the kick. You can push that kick up into the limiter, and it's not going to be blowing out your subs because your subs are way down here, right? So this would be a punchy kick even if you lopped it off right here. This would be a punchy kick even if you lopped it off right here, as long as there's a little bit of room for the sub to ring out underneath and not also be lopped off. So it's just another way of looking at it. Yeah, see here, this thing here, this is the actual kick waveform. And you'll see kicks like this. This is kind of an 808, right? Tiny little thump at the beginning, kind of a long thing here. Now, all these dips and valleys and raises, these are phase issues. This is a kick that was made with layering, and whoever designed this kick didn't care about how the layers were phase incoherent with each other in places. And so when things are out of phase, the volume drops in the final result. So this is a phase incoherent area right here where it's dipping down, and this is a big phase incoherent area here, and it doesn't, it's only here that the waveforms stop interfering with each other, and it just turns into this big boomy sub that quickly decays out, right? So be aware when you're using kicks and you're blending them with subs, you want something more shaped like this. And again, you can see that in this XO particular kick I use. They even show you a little picture right over here. See how it's a triangular looking kick, and this is less triangular. It has a little bit of a rise and then falls. This is a more boomy, subby kind of kick, but this is a good one for blending. Okay, so why that's important is when you have a triangular shape to your kick and then you're crossfading up a sub, you end up with this triangular drop that you can cut into with your limiter and clipper, but at some point the combined crossfading sub and kick signal kind of level out and become level with each other, and that's what you want. You want it down far enough that you have some room to push this into a limiter, but you're not cutting into where your body subby kick summing area is. So this is a kind of ideal shape for a combined kick and a sub. And that's all we're going to say about that. It's another way to look at your result, look at the combined result. Now, let's talk a little bit about, actually, let's do this one first. Let's talk a little bit about why your kick and your sub are so important to the limiter and why we really have to pay attention to their total energy. These are a couple different spectrum analyzers, and it's a little messy. But this yellow line here is what pink noise looks like being fed into this spectrum analyzer. And it's kind of a reference line. This is pink noise, and you'll notice it looks almost completely horizontal across, especially this dotted line, which represents kind of the RMS across the spectrum, whereas the solid line is kind of the peaks across the spectrum. So you can see that the average energy, the RMS, the dotted yellow line for pink noise looks almost perfectly horizontal. And that's because this particular meter, this is my favorite spectrum analyzer, it is set to use a slope of -3 dB per octave roll-off. Now this is Voxengo span, which is also, you can see I've clicked the settings button and I've set it to a slope of 3.0, which is -3 dB per octave. By default, span uses a different slope. And here's the deal. Other genres like rock, jazz, orchestra stuff, acoustic singer-songwriter stuff, those types of musical genres are not nearly as bright sounding as pop and electronic music. EDM, electronic music, pop music is really freaking bright. There's a lot more high-end energy in our songs than there is in a 1970s classic rock tune. The mastering engineers and the mix engineers back then, and even now for certain older genres like that, like if you're a recording engineer now mixing a jazz session, you're going to have a slope in your spectrum analyzer that's more like -4.5 dB per octave or even -6 dB per octave. And that's because you want a darker sound. You want less brightness in the high end. You want to emphasize the mids and kind of the low bass region. But EDM, we like bright sounds. And what's really cool about that is we can set our spectrum analyzers to basically make pink noise look straight across. And if you make pink noise look straight across, that makes double checking your mix in your spectrum analyzer really easy, because a good looking mix will effectively look more or less straight across in its energy, especially from about 500 to 700 to 400 and up. So you can see this portion here is a little bit low energy here. Like there's not enough brightness here, but if I could fill up this green area all the way out to here and then slowly start rolling off around 12 or 14K, that would be a pretty good looking spectral balance for my high end, right? And you can kind of see that over here. This is more or less the same waveform. The peak, see, the problem is this is showing peaks, whereas this meter will show me the average energy. And here you can see the average line is almost straight in this region here. And then it starts to roll off in the highs, the super highs. But here's what's important. In EDM music, especially bass-heavy electronic music, anything that's festival-oriented, anything that's got subs that make you just, vibrate the air in your lungs at a festival, make you grab the rails, make you headbang, squish your body in all sorts of different directions. EDM has a lot of sub energy. And the subs and the low end below about 300 hertz, 500 hertz, 400 hertz, from there down, this part of the spectrum is going to sit higher than where you want everything else in the spectrum. So this is where your peaks happen. This is where the limiter hits. It's always hitting on this low subregion first. It's always all the energy down here that causes us the most trouble with mastering and mixing, but especially mastering because of limiters. They just hit this and there's a brick wall, and then it just crushes and flattens out and makes your kick body and your kicks and your sub and your combined kick and sub, it'll just tub them out if you push this area too hard into a limiter. So this is one way of looking at it. Now there's the other diagram's a little better. This is a better mix. And again, this spectrum analyzer is set to be a -3 dB per octave slope. So pink noise looks pretty much flat across. And these are two really good mixes, especially this one on the bottom. This is Puff Puff Give by my mentor, Il Gates. And this is like a picture perfect spectrum, right? This whole area from 3 to 400 to 500K just looks nice and filled out, starts having a little bit of a roll off around 13K, and that's normal and okay to do that. But you'll notice that the subs aren't as drastically much higher than what's going on down here, but take a really close look, especially at this darker filled in area down here, which is the average energy. Don't look at the peak line so much. See how most of this spectrum down here in the average energy is sitting right at the negative 36 dB line, okay? Now keep following that line over and look at the subregion. The subregion is poking all the way up to slightly above the negative 24 dB line. That's 12 decibels different. And this little part that's humping up above, that's basically the body of the snare. That's where the snare body's hitting right there. So snare, kick, sub, the three loudest things in the mix, like all electronic music should be. And it, just at a glance, it looks like the whole thing's more or less straight across, but really there's a big jump here. This scale is like 12 decibels per line. So this is actually sitting up quite a bit higher than the rest of the mix. And this is like picture perfect. This is what mastered results should look like. And I was comparing it against one of my tracks. This is, my name is Bathymetrics, and just, you can use a referencing tool like this to say, am I more or less in the same ballpark as my reference track? Does my spectrum look similar? And you can see that my sub area is a little heavier maybe than it should be. It's poking up a little higher than the sub area did in Puff Puff Give. But again, this was a heavier song. So there's a little wiggle room here for how heavy you want your song to be, especially in electronic, aggressive dance music genres. So there's a little wiggle room here, but, at some point later on in the process, I probably pulled this down a bit because it's just a bit too high. So anyway, the point is, this is always the thing that gets affected by your limiter first. And I can demonstrate that super quickly. We're going to leave this open. Go back to the master track where it came from. Now, in front of this oscilloscope where this picture is coming from, I have two limiters. I'm going to use Elevate by Newfangled Audio and Eventide. Let's activate this because it has a lot of latency. Let's turn it on. Let's bring it up. Now what I'm going to do is push this kick and sub combined waveform. I'm going to push this into this limiter, and we're going to look at the, I think this is the view I want here. So let's see if I can make this not be loud to you. We're going to match the level. We're going to do auto. I think that's how we keep it from getting ridiculous. And we're going to go over here to the main parameters, and let me just take all the drive out, all the clipping out. Okay, this is probably good. So here's the signal. And let's turn this off so it's bypassed, right? So here's the original signal that's coming into this limiter. And then when I turn on the limiter with the current settings, it's going to change it a little bit. Now, this limiter is a little tricky because one of the reasons people like Elevate is it has really, really smart transient management, and it does limiting in a way that can do some final coloration and shaping. So what you're hearing is the transient emphasis is up fairly high, and it's basically emphasizing the transient of this kick and sub, right? It's pushing this up, but it's leaving this right where it was. Watch, when I bypass it on and off, you're going to see this portion of the sub and kick hit combined. You're going to see it staying right about at this line. Watch. And as I turn it off, see, this portion of the kick is untouched. It's only emphasizing the transient, which, again, during mastering and you're finally saying, is the kick punching through? Is it really sounding the way I want in the mix? You might want that, right? I could pull this transient emphasis down and it'll probably be a little different. So let's unbypass it. Right, see, now it's not nearly as heavily transient. Bring the transient up again. Look at that. I can shape my transients during mastering. This is why people love Elevate. This is not a beginner's mastering limiter. Don't use this if you're a beginner. Go get Ozone or go get FabFilter Pro L. It's much easier to wrap your head around. But let's look at what happens. I'm going to take all the transient emphasis off, and now we're going to start crushing this into the ceiling of the limiter, and we're going to start watching this get shaved down. So I'm just pushing the drive up, pushing the drive up, pushing the drive up, and now you can see that my transients have been shaved. Now I've put 5.9 dB of drive. I'm getting 4.6 dB of gain reduction over here. Now I want you to listen to this. I haven't really touched these sub and kick body regions at all, but we've got 4.8 dB more volume out of this thing, right? When I bypass it on and off, it's going to sound almost identical. Check it out. Now I want you to notice something. You heard it get a tiny bit brighter on the kick transient when it's active, but listen to the sub and listen to how the sub boom never changes. The sub boom stays constant. Only the kick gets a tiny bit brighter. Hear that? That's what you want. In mastering, your kicks are going to end up getting a little brighter because those transients are going to get squashed. And when you squash a transient a little bit, you're going to get some distortion, which is going to add a tiny bit more high-end brightness. And then, you could work to like reverse EQ your kick a little bit to minimize that if you don't like it. But the point is, we're not distorting and crushing the subs. Now, at the same level of gain, I'm not going to change anything on the limiter. Watch what happens when we go back to the version that wasn't ducked. So the waveform, I'm going to bypass just for a second just to show you what the waveform looks like. This is the version that isn't ducked and balanced much, right? So we've got the classic bad use case where here's the kick, but then the combined kick and sub are even higher than the initial transient of the kick. Now watch what happens to this when we run it through the limiter. See how it just gets flabby and mushy and loses all its energy? The sub is noticeably reduced and it starts sounding flabby because these are all being pushed down and it's changing the timbre and it's just completely destroying the sub balance. That sounds good, kind of. That sounds terrible. Now let's go back to where it's ducked and we have the proper shape and listen again to how it sounds pretty much the same either way. See, the sub energy stays the same even when it's limited. So that's pretty much our entire tour of the kick and sub relationship. I want you to take your time, review this, think about the final result, which is going through a limiter, and start using oscilloscopes. They're your best friend. Start paying attention to your subphase. Coherence with your kick, that's your best friend. And definitely pay attention to your ducking shapes and get good merged results from your kicks and snares. Thanks, and I'll